The lights were warm, the laughter was easy, and everything looked exactly the way late-night television is supposed to look, until one unexpected question shifted the mood in real time. In a matter of seconds, smiles tightened, energy changed, and millions of viewers watching live could feel it. This wasn't a scandal, and it wasn't chaos. It was something quieter, more human. And that's exactly why it mattered. Subscribe to the Truth Narrator, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Late-night talk shows are designed to feel safe. They're built on rehearsed beats, practiced charm, and a shared understanding between host and guest. This is entertainment, not an interrogation. But every once in a while, live television reminds us that it isn't fully controllable. And on one particular night on Jimmy Kimmel Live, a conversation between Kate Hudson and Jimmy Kimmel drifted just far enough off script to expose something raw. Kate Hudson had arrived on the show as she always did, poised, confident, and effortlessly likable. By that point in her career, she wasn't just known as an actress. She was a public figure shaped by decades in the spotlight, the daughter of Hollywood royalty, and someone audiences felt they already knew. Her laugh was familiar. Her openness was part of her brand. She had spent years cultivating an image of warmth and honesty, someone comfortable sharing parts of her personal life without ever seeming vulnerable. Jimmy Kimmel, on the other hand, was operating in his natural habitat. As the host of Jimmy Kimmel Live, he was known for his relaxed style, his ability to disarm guests with humor, and his talent for sliding from jokes into sincerity without warning. His interviews often felt conversational rather than confrontational, which is precisely why guests trusted him. The show itself thrived on that balance, funny, personal, but rarely uncomfortable. This is what made the moment stand out. On paper, there was nothing risky about the booking. Hudson was there to promote her latest project, to laugh, to tell a few stories, and to leave the stage having reminded viewers why she was so beloved. The audience expected charm. The producers expected applause. The viewers at home expected another polished celebrity appearance to play in the background while they folded laundry or scrolled on their phones. What they got instead was a subtle emotional shift that couldn't be edited out. Because this wasn't pre-recorded. This wasn't cleaned up in post. This was live television, unedited, unfolding second by second. And when emotions surfaced, there was no rewind button. The power of this moment wasn't in raised voices or shocking accusations. It was in restraint. In pauses, in the way a carefully maintained public image momentarily cracked, not from pressure, but from honesty. The question that changed the tone wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even inappropriate, but it landed differently than expected, and Kate Hudson's reaction made that clear. For viewers who caught it live, there was a brief sense of uncertainty. Was this part of the show? Was this still banter? Or had the conversation crossed into something more personal than anyone anticipated? The studio audience, trained to laugh on cue, hesitated. The laughter softened. Applause didn't come as quickly. Something real was happening, and everyone felt it. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand what live TV represents. It's one of the last places where celebrities don't have full control. Social media can be curated. Interviews can be edited. Public statements can be revised. But live broadcasts expose reactions before they're filtered, before they're processed, before they're packaged. Kate Hudson has spoken often about authenticity, about being open, about emotional honesty, about navigating life under public scrutiny. But there's a difference between choosing to share something and being unexpectedly confronted with it in front of an audience. That line is thin, and on this night, it became visible. Jimmy Kimmel sensed it too. As a seasoned host, he had navigated difficult moments before. He understood timing. He understood tone. And as the atmosphere shifted, his role subtly changed, from entertainer to moderator, from jokester to guide. The way he adjusted, the way he responded in real time, would become just as important as the question itself. This is why the moment lingered long after the show ended. Not because it was explosive, but because it was honest. In an industry built on performance, the smallest unscripted reactions can feel enormous. A pause can speak louder than a monologue. A breath can reveal more than a confession. And for viewers who noticed it, this exchange became one of those rare late-night moments that felt less like television and more like real life breaking through the format. Clips would later circulate. Headlines would hint at emotion and tension. Fans would debate whether the question went too far or whether the reaction was simply human. But in the moment, none of that existed yet. There was only a host, a guest, and a conversation unfolding live, with no safety net. And that's where the story truly begins. Before the question, before the silence, before anyone realized they were watching something more than just another celebrity interview. Because what led to that moment, and what followed it, reveals far more than a single exchange ever could. Long before Kate Hudson stepped onto that stage, her public image had already been carefully shaped by years of exposure, expectation, and comparison. From the moment she entered Hollywood, she was never just another actress. She was the daughter of Goldie Hawn, raised in an industry where cameras were normal and privacy was optional. That background gave her an unusual ease in interviews, but it also meant her personal life had always been treated as public property. By the time she appeared on Jimmy Kimmel Live, Kate Hudson was in a transitional phase of her career. She was no longer the breakout romantic comedy star audiences first fell in love with, nor was she chasing the same validation she once did in her 20s. She had spoken openly in other interviews about motherhood, relationships, personal growth, and the pressure of being perceived as effortlessly happy. Her honesty was part of why audiences trusted her, but it also made her more emotionally exposed. In the weeks leading up to the appearance, Hudson had been doing press rounds that leaned heavily into personal storytelling. She talked about balancing work and family, about how her priorities had shifted, and about learning to define success on her own terms. None of this was controversial. In fact, it was refreshingly grounded, but it subtly reframed how people saw her. She wasn't just promoting a project anymore. She was narrating her own evolution. Jimmy Kimmel's show was a natural stop on that journey. Jimmy Kimmel Live had built its reputation on blending humor with sincerity. Guests often arrived expecting jokes and left having revealed something unexpectedly personal. Kimmel himself was known for asking questions that felt casual but carried emotional weight. He had a way of circling topics gently, letting guests walk into deeper territory on their own. Most of the time, it worked beautifully. Sometimes, though, it led somewhere less predictable. The structure of a late-night interview is deceptively simple. The opening minutes are light, jokes, compliments, laughter. Then comes the promotional segment, where the guest talks about their latest work. After that, if time allows, the conversation often drifts into something more personal. This drift is usually agreed upon in advance. Publicists brief hosts. Boundaries are quietly set. Everyone knows which subjects are safe. But live television compresses all of this into a narrow window. There's no room to recalibrate if a question lands differently than expected. There's no pause to renegotiate tone. What happens, happens. Kate Hudson arrived that night relaxed and smiling, greeting Jimmy Kimmel with the familiarity of someone who had done this many times before. The audience responded warmly. There was no tension in the room. Her body language was open. She laughed easily. Everything about the setup suggested a routine appearance. Yet beneath that ease was something less visible. Hudson had spent years navigating public narratives about her relationships, her family, and her emotional life. While she often addressed these topics with humor, they weren't abstract to her. They were lived experiences. Each mention, each question carried history. Even when asked casually, certain subjects required emotional energy to revisit. Jimmy Kimmel, for his part, was doing what he always did, listening closely, reacting in real time, and steering the conversation based on her responses. He wasn't pushing. He wasn't provoking. But as the interview progressed, the tone gradually shifted from playful to reflective. The laughter slowed. Answers became longer. Hudson's expressions grew more thoughtful. This is where foreshadowing begins. In live interviews, moments before something changes are often indistinguishable from normal conversation. There's no warning music, no dramatic cut, just a subtle alteration in rhythm, a pause that lasts a beat longer than usual, a smile that doesn't fully return. The topic turned toward personal fulfillment, how success feels different now, how perspectives change with time. These were themes Hudson had spoken about before, but each time she spoke about them, she did so from wherever she was emotionally at that moment. And on this night, she was reflective, perhaps more than usual. The audience followed along quietly. They weren't laughing as loudly anymore, not because the conversation was uncomfortable, but because it demanded attention. This wasn't background noise television. It was the kind of exchange that makes people look up from their phones. Jimmy Kimmel sensed that attentiveness. He adjusted his posture slightly, leaning in rather than back. His tone softened. The conversation slowed. This was no longer just about promoting a film. It was about meaning, about personal truth. And then came the setup for the question. It didn't arrive abruptly. It was preceded by context, by shared understanding, by what felt like a natural progression. That's what made it so effective, and so risky. When questions are asked gently, they often reach deeper places. And when they do, the response can be unpredictable. Kate Hudson listened closely, nodding as Kimmel spoke. Her expression suggested she understood where he was going before he finished. That anticipation mattered. It meant the emotional impact wasn't sudden. It was building. In that brief space before the question was fully formed, there was already tension. Not the kind fueled by conflict, but the kind created when someone realizes they're about to speak honestly in a space that doesn't allow revision. Live television thrives on that edge. Neither the audience nor the viewers at home could have known exactly what was about to happen, but they could feel that the interview was no longer operating on autopilot. Something personal was approaching, something that wouldn't be brushed off with a joke. And when the question finally arrived, it wouldn't shock because of what it asked, but because of how truthfully it was answered. The moment everything shifted was seconds away, unfolding in real time, with no edits, no safety net, and no way to pull the emotion back once it surfaced. The question arrived without ceremony. There was no dramatic pause engineered for effect, no sharp turn in tone that signaled danger. It came the way many late-night questions do, calm, conversational, framed as curiosity rather than challenge. Jimmy Kimmel asked it gently, almost carefully, as if trusting the space they had created together. On paper, it was a reasonable question, one that fit the theme of reflection, growth, and personal evolution they had been discussing. But live television isn't about paper. It's about timing. For a brief second after the question was asked, Kate Hudson didn't respond. It wasn't long enough to feel scripted, but it was long enough to be noticed. In that silence, the studio changed. The audience, which moments earlier had been relaxed and responsive, went still. You could sense people leaning forward, instinctively aware that something unscripted was unfolding. Hudson's face shifted first. Her smile didn't disappear, but it softened. The easy expression she'd been carrying settled into something more measured, more inward. She blinked once, then again, as if recalibrating. Her posture changed subtly, shoulders drawing in just a fraction, hands coming together in her lap. These were small movements, but on live television, small movements speak loudly. Jimmy Kimmel didn't interrupt the silence. Experienced hosts often fill gaps quickly, worried about dead air. Kimmel didn't. He waited. That choice mattered. By not rushing to soften the moment, he allowed it to exist as it was. The pause stretched just enough for viewers to register it, not as awkwardness, but as processing. When Kate Hudson finally began to speak, her voice was steady, but quieter than before. The playful rhythm that had defined the earlier part of the interview was gone. In its place was something slower, more deliberate. She chose her words carefully, not because she was avoiding the question, but because she was answering it honestly. As she spoke, her eyes briefly dropped away from Kimmel, then returned. This wasn't avoidance, it was introspection. She wasn't performing for the audience in that moment. She was thinking out loud live, with millions of people listening. The studio remained silent. No laughter, no applause, just attention. Hudson acknowledged the complexity of what she was being asked. She didn't deflect with humor, and she didn't overshare. Instead, she spoke in measured truths, about change, about expectations, about how certain aspects of her life had felt different than people assumed from the outside. There was no bitterness in her tone, but there was weight. Live television rarely allows for weight. As she continued, her breathing became more noticeable. Not labored, not dramatic, but present. The kind of breathing that comes when someone is aware of their own emotions, but chooses to keep speaking anyway. Her eyes glistened slightly under the studio lights. Not enough to suggest tears, but enough to suggest proximity. Jimmy Kimmel listened without interrupting. His expression shifted from host mode to human attentiveness. He nodded slowly, offering no commentary, no jokes, no attempts to redirect. In that moment, he wasn't guiding the interview. He was witnessing it. The audience followed his lead. This was one of those rare stretches of late-night television where time seems to slow. Every word landed heavier because there was nowhere for it to hide. No edit, no cutaway, no music. Just a conversation happening live, exactly as it was. Kate Hudson reached the end of her answer not with a conclusion, but with a pause. It wasn't a cliffhanger in the traditional sense. It was an emotional full stop. She exhaled softly, as if releasing something she hadn't planned to carry onto that stage. The silence that followed was different from the first. This time, it wasn't anticipation, it was absorption. Jimmy Kimmel responded gently, acknowledging her words without reframing them, without turning them into a punchline. His voice was calm, respectful. He thanked her, not in the performative way hosts sometimes do, but sincerely. It was a recognition that something real had just been shared. And still, the moment wasn't over. Because what made this exchange linger wasn't just what was said, it was what couldn't be taken back. Once spoken live, words become part of the record. They're clipped, replayed, analyzed. They live beyond the studio, beyond the night they were aired. As the conversation moved forward, the energy never fully returned to its earlier lightness. Even as the show attempted to regain rhythm, something had shifted permanently. The audience applauded again, but differently. The laughter, when it came, was gentler. For viewers at home, multitasking just moments earlier, this was the point where attention locked in. Phones were put down. Conversations paused. Something meaningful had happened, and it demanded to be noticed. But what happened next, how the room reacted, how the host adapted, and how this moment echoed beyond the broadcast, would define whether this was simply an emotional exchange or something more lasting. Stay with the Truth Narrator, because the aftermath of this live moment reveals why a few seconds of silence on television can change everything. When the conversation moved on, it did so carefully, as if everyone in the room understood that the atmosphere had changed and couldn't simply be reset. The transition was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The show continued, yet it was no longer operating on autopilot. There was a shared awareness between host, guest, audience, and viewers at home that something real had just happened. The studio audience was the first indicator. Applause came a moment later than usual, softer and more measured. It wasn't the enthusiastic reaction that typically follows a celebrity anecdote. It was the kind of response reserved for moments that feel personal, moments that don't belong entirely to entertainment. People weren't applauding a performance, they were acknowledging honesty. Kate Hudson's posture after the exchange reflected that shift. She remained composed, but the ease that defined the beginning of the interview didn't fully return. Her hands stayed close together. Her expressions were calm but inward. She smiled again when prompted, but the smile now carried restraint rather than playfulness. It was the expression of someone who had shared something meaningful and was still sitting with it. Jimmy Kimmel adjusted instinctively. Experienced hosts learned to read rooms the way pilots read instruments. Kimmel didn't attempt to lighten the mood too aggressively. He didn't rush into jokes that would undercut what had just been said. Instead, he slowed the pace of the interview. His voice remained warm, but his questions became simpler, safer, almost grounding. This was damage control, not in a negative sense, but in a human one. The role of a late-night host isn't just to entertain. It's to protect the flow of the show while respecting the person across from them. In that moment, Kimmel chose respect over momentum. He allowed space for Hudson to regain her footing without drawing attention to the emotional shift. The audience followed his lead. Laughter returned gradually, cautiously. When Hudson laughed, it felt like a release rather than a response to a joke. Each beat of the conversation was handled with care, as though everyone understood that the emotional temperature had to cool naturally, not abruptly. From the control room to the studio floor, producers were undoubtedly aware of what had occurred. But because the show was live, there was nothing to edit, nothing to reshape. The only option was to move forward with intention. And that's exactly what happened. Hudson remained engaged, answering questions thoughtfully, but the dynamic had changed. She was still present, still professional, yet subtly more guarded. Not defensive, just aware. The earlier openness had given way to reflection, and that shift lingered in every response that followed. For viewers at home, this was where the moment deepened. Those who had sensed the emotional turn now watched more closely. Social media reactions began almost immediately, with viewers commenting in real time about the seriousness of the exchange. Some expressed admiration for Hudson's honesty. Others noted the unusual quiet that had settled over the interview. A few questioned whether the topic had gone too far. All of them recognized that this wasn't a typical late-night segment. What stood out most was how quickly the energy of the room had changed, and how it never fully returned to what it had been. Even as the interview wrapped up, there was a sense of closure rather than celebration. When Hudson was thanked for coming on the show, the exchange felt genuine, almost personal. It didn't feel like a routine sign-off. It felt like the end of a conversation that had required trust. As the show moved into its next segment, the contrast was noticeable. The rhythm picked up again, but the emotional residue of the interview remained. For anyone watching closely, it was clear that the moment hadn't been isolated. It had affected the entire broadcast. For Kate Hudson, the immediate impact was subtle but significant. She had navigated the moment with grace, but she had also revealed something unscripted. In an industry where control is currency, that kind of exposure carries weight. It follows you off the stage, into headlines, into public discussion. For Jimmy Kimmel, the moment reinforced the delicate balance of live television. His handling of the aftermath, calm, respectful, unforced, prevented the exchange from becoming exploitative. He didn't frame it as drama. He allowed it to stand on its own. And for the audience, both in the studio and at home, the aftermath confirmed what they had felt in real time. This wasn't just an emotional answer. It was a turning point within the interview, one that reshaped how everything that followed was received. But the true impact of the moment wouldn't be measured that night. It would unfold in the days and weeks after the broadcast. As clips circulated, conversations continued, and the meaning of those few quiet seconds on live television began to take shape in the public consciousness. In the days after the broadcast, the moment took on a life of its own, not because it was sensational, but because it was restrained. Clips circulated quietly at first, shared by viewers who recognized something familiar in Kate Hudson's response. There were no dramatic headlines, no manufactured outrage. Instead, the discussion centered on tone, honesty, and the rare vulnerability of a live exchange that wasn't designed to go viral. That restraint mattered. In an era where celebrity moments are often amplified through exaggeration, this one stood out for the opposite reason. It didn't rely on shock. It didn't hinge on conflict. Its impact came from recognition. The recognition that even the most polished public figures carry unguarded emotions, and that live television can still reveal them. For Kate Hudson, the long-term effect wasn't reputational damage or controversy. If anything, it reinforced the image she had been gradually shaping for years. Viewers didn't see her as exposed or unprepared. They saw her as human. Someone willing to answer honestly, even when the answer required emotional effort. That kind of authenticity doesn't always trend loudly, but it lasts. Media coverage reflected that tone. Articles and commentary focused less on the question itself, and more on the atmosphere surrounding it. Writers noted the pause, the silence, the way the studio reacted. Analysts pointed out how rare it is for a late-night interview to slow down rather than speed up, to allow space rather than fill it. The conversation became less about what was asked and more about how it was handled. Jimmy Kimmel's role in the moment was also reassessed in that light. As the host of Jimmy Kimmel Live, he had navigated countless interviews, many of them personal, some of them difficult. What stood out here was his decision not to interrupt, not to redirect too quickly, not to turn vulnerability into entertainment. His restraint signaled an understanding of responsibility, one that often goes unnoticed unless it's absent. That approach shaped how the moment aged. Rather than becoming a cautionary tale about boundaries crossed, it became an example of live television done thoughtfully. A reminder that authenticity doesn't have to be exploited to be meaningful. That silence, when respected, can be more powerful than any punchline. For audiences, the moment resonated because it mirrored real-life conversations. Those brief instances when someone answers honestly and the room changes. When laughter stops not because something went wrong, but because something real entered the space. Late-night television rarely allows for that kind of reflection, which is why it lingers when it happens. Culturally, the exchange arrived at a time when public figures were being asked to be both open and invulnerable, relatable yet endlessly composed. Kate Hudson's response quietly challenged that contradiction. It showed that openness isn't always neat, and that composure doesn't mean emotional absence. Sometimes it means staying present through discomfort. That's why the moment still matters. Not because it altered careers or sparked controversy, but because it demonstrated the value of unedited truth in a highly edited world. It reminded viewers that live television, for all its polish, still carries risk, and that risk is what makes it meaningful. Years from now, this exchange may not be remembered as a defining scandal or a viral clip. Instead, it will be remembered as something subtler. A few seconds where the performance paused, where honesty surfaced, and where everyone watching understood that what they were seeing couldn't be rehearsed. And those moments, rare as they are the ones that endure. If you value thoughtful storytelling that looks beyond headlines and into the moments that reveal something deeper, subscribe to the Truth Narrator, like this video. Share it with someone who appreciates real conversations, and let us know your perspective in the comments. Because sometimes the quietest moments on live television tell the loudest truths.